Hello, my name is Nathan Brumman. I hope you're having a great day. Today is my third talk in a series that's entitled Prophetic Talks on the Act of Preaching. And today what we're doing is we're talking about weaknesses in seminary students that rise out of the fact that they don't have a natural eloquence, that they need to learn how to be eloquent. They need to learn how to communicate. With Charles Spurgeon, you see it was different. Charles Spurgeon was someone who had a natural eloquence. And a reason why he didn't use so much paper in the pulpit or an iPad is because he had a natural understanding of eloquence. That's what we want to talk about today. The problem with some seminary students is that they're focusing on simply communicating what they wrote down. And I realize that seminary students don't want to say something heretical. And so they can be very concerned on saying the right thing. And behind this, of course, is the problem that their professors aren't encouraging them to see the preaching moment as an interactive event in which the congregation is responding to him. What I find is that most professors in seminaries, most, not all, most do realize that in the act of preaching, it is a responsive event. But what happens is that when students sit in class and are being taught how to preach, because their professors are focusing on proper structure, correct exegesis, and so on, the student goes away without realizing the importance of viewing the act of preaching as an interaction with the congregation. And so the seminary student even avoids looking at the congregation because that makes him nervous. And so he tries to ignore the congregation, but then just somehow expects that they should simply listen to him. I don't know why. Maybe because he thinks, well, I am this marvelous seminary student, and my sermons are the most interesting sermons that have ever been written. And then, of course, part of the problem is that the seminarian's emotions are not being fired by the latest idea that he is considering. He is simply, reciting what he wrote about the idea. And then he goes on to the next idea. And what he doesn't do is he doesn't allow the present idea to sink into his heart so that he can communicate in a way that is striking, in a way that can make an impact on the congregation. He's not trying to use fresh ways of communicating. He's not thinking about impacting the congregation. I think that's what strikes me about the importance of the act of preaching. We bring the Word of God hoping that Christ, by His Spirit, will cause the Word to have an impact on the congregation. But maybe in his study, the astonishing ideas in the text haven't impacted the seminarian or the mature minister, and therefore he doesn't try to get that message to impact his congregation. Now, that's something that bothers me about preaching too. When I'm reading a text, I'm really realizing that in a text there are these astonishing insights, these amazing things, and then a seminary student or a minister can just talk about them as if they're the most boring, hunky-dory things that everybody has heard of already in their lives. That tells you that the person hasn't internalized the teaching of the text. Also, it's hard for someone who is just reading their sermon to use things like repetition effectively or variety in speed or volume because he's simply reading what is before him and he's finished reading one paragraph and now it's time to read the next paragraph. A reader is often emotionally handicapped. And that's why I do not think that anyone should read their sermon. And so the seminary student often is reading his sermon. He's trying to avoid heresies. He's trying to say things right, but he forgets the dictum that those who speak so that children can listen soon find that adults will understand. He is not simplifying things. He's not looking at the congregation, at the children. Now, he might even mention the children and even claim to address them, but the children aren't fooled, and their attention immediately wanders because the preacher is not really trying to communicate to them in a simple and effective way. He's not trying to communicate to them. He's simply reading what he wrote to read to them. So the preacher needs to take the time to stop and make sure that what he's saying is simple and interesting, that the children are paying attention, and he can work on getting their attention. Sometimes that might mean that you even address them specifically, and you wait for all their eyes to get up and look on you. But you see, when you've internalized the message, you grasp its relevance and importance. And when you're trying to communicate it to the people who are sitting in the pews and the children, then guess what you do? Well, you work on it. You work on communicating. See, that's what I don't see happening. Ministers don't work on communicating in the act of preaching. Charles Spurgeon tells theological students that they must be interested, and then you will interest others. Now, I have rarely thought that ministers who read their sermons were engrossed in their message. Spurgeon says your subject must weigh so much upon your own mind that you dedicate all your faculties at their best to the deliverance of your soul concerning it. And then when your hearers see that the topic has engrossed you, it will by degrees engross them. Now, don't we find that in ordinary life when someone is excited about something? Well, when someone else is excited about something and they're telling me about it, there's something natural about drawing me into it, and I can become engrossed and interested too. So Spurgeon says that the preacher must make, notice that strong language, must make the people feel that they have an interest in what we are saying to them. Now, I think that some ministers might think, well, that's too strong. It's like you're trying to work too hard. But notice what Spurgeon says. The preacher must make the people feel. No, we have a role in this. We have a role in trying to grab the attention of the congregation, to tell them why what we're telling them is so important, why they need to take it to heart. And Spurgeon says that he has never heard of a person falling to sleep while a will was being read in which he expected a legacy. I bet not. And guess what? I've never heard of a prisoner falling to sleep either while a judge was summing up what was going to be a sentence and the man's life was hanging in jeopardy. No, Spurgeon says that self-interest quickens attention. And so, yes, when you preach upon a practical theme or even a theological theme that people should realize that is important for their practical life, when you preach on things that are personal matters, that are relevant, Spurgeon says, well, then you will secure an earnest hearing. So Spurgeon would not have used an iPad because he had a natural understanding of eloquence. He was a born speaker. Now, most of us need to learn how to communicate. If we have a wife or a girlfriend while we're going to seminary, we need to ask our girlfriend or wife to point out mistakes that we're making. My wife, for so many times, I said, okay, you're blinking your eyes too much. Or she says, you're using too many hand gestures. Or you're using a hand gesture that looks like you're pointing a gun at people. And so our wives can give us really, really helpful feedback. Now, why do we need feedback from our wives or feedback from our professors while we're in seminary? Well, it's because we are not, most of us, natural communicators like Spurgeon was. Ministers can have all kinds of challenges. They can say, all kinds of times in one sermon and not even seem to realize it. I've sat in church before and I've just counted how many ums the minister made per minute. Astonishing. So you see, the problem is that we can't evaluate ourselves so easily. When we're preaching in front of people, when we're in the act of communication, it's hard for us to have the self-awareness of saying, okay, this is what I'm doing wrong, or this is distracting, or, always putting my hands up to my glasses. Okay, that's something that's distracting. Or how I'm standing, or if I'm standing with my hands behind my back. One time I remember being at Westminster West while Edmund Clowney was analyzing, critiquing his students in practice preaching. He said, you look like you're waiting for a bus at a bus stop. So there's all kinds of different mistakes that we can make with our speech. For example, my wife would catch me using the same word too much. I would use the word point. I'm making this point, and I needed to stop using the word. So other people can help us with mistakes that we are making, or if we're talking too fast, or if we're talking too high. Whatever the issues might be, because we're not perfect, and because we're not born eloquent, we need to benefit from feedback, criticism from other people. Now, Spurgeon was different. For us, we need to grow in our rhetorical abilities. We need to grow in the use of our voice, for example. But Spurgeon had such native intelligence about communication that from his earliest years, he seemed to understand the principles of eloquence without having a teacher. God also gave him a mature spirituality as a 20-year-old. And he had a native ability to communicate without having to learn by hard practice, for example, the power of pauses, or how to affect an audience, or how to wield his marvelous voice. Spurgeon just seemed to naturally understand that eloquence involved several matters. He knew how to communicate without taking classes on rhetoric. He knew that communication required eye contact with the congregation. I mean, some ministers today are so weak in their communication abilities that they don't even seem to grasp the importance of eye contact. In fact, I did an internship under a minister who just when he was around people, like when he was around me, he couldn't even look me in the eye. But because Spurgeon, you see, knew the importance of preaching as communication, would not have allowed an iPad or paper to come between his eyes and the congregation. Later on, Martin Lloyd-Jones would talk about the importance of the minister reading the congregation. Yes, don't just read a manuscript or your outline, but read the congregation. And Lloyd-Jones emphasized that you receive communication back from the congregation again. Preaching is two-way communication. Now, I know that in Dutch Reformed churches, you could be naive about this and act like it doesn't happen. Now, when I preach in prison to congregations that have a large number of Hispanics and African Americans in them, they are very responsive to the preaching. In fact, in a black church, there is a very public recognition of the fact that preaching is two-way communication, and the preacher expects the congregation to be responsive to what he's saying, verbally responsive. And the congregation expects the minister to be even interacting with them. And I don't care what kind of congregation or audience you have, there is going to be two-way communication. And there's communication between the preacher and individuals in the congregation. When I see a lady in the congregation, for example, beginning to cry, okay, there's communication coming back to me there. And there's also communication between the congregation as a whole. There are some congregations where the reality is that you can tell that the whole congregation comes to church excited to hear the word preached. Whereas you go into a different congregation and you find that there's just not that excitement there. And you realize that on Sunday morning, when no one should be so terribly tired, I'm thinking too how there can be Sunday afternoon services I preached at, but on Sunday mornings already, you can feel that there's a deadness and a dullness to the church, that you're going to have to work hard to just win their attention. So individual saints communicate by a bright smile of joy. I love it when I see that. Or by tears of sorrow. Well, then I know too that the saints need encouragement. Spurgeon knew that eloquence flowed out of passion and spontaneity in the act of preaching. Now, my son a little while ago walked by and he said, "Dad," he said, "it's kind of funny that you're talking about really, spontaneity, and you're talking about matters of speaking without having prepared every word you're going to say, and yet you're partly reading a manuscript through a teleprompter." And he's right. Here, there's a funny thing here. I'm speaking to you partly by looking at chapters that I have written on the subject of preaching, and so I'm using them to spur myself as I talk to you. At the same time, as I talk to you, I need to use some spontaneity, or things get very, very boring. But Notice how what I'm doing right now is not the ideal thing of what I think I should do in a pulpit. When I'm in the pulpit, I should not be using a teleprompter. That's, of course, the problem with many of our politicians. They use teleprompters to give their messages. Charles Spurgeon would not have used a teleprompter, because what do teleprompters have on them? Well, I can't even fit an outline on my teleprompter. It really won't work. All you can do is put your written essay things down in essay form. But the problem with the teleprompter is it has laid out for you all the words that you already wrote. And so where's the spontaneity? If you just read it, the spontaneity is lacking. The emotion is lacking. So I feel, of course, the need, even as I look at some ideas I've written down, I have to diverge from them so that I can be spontaneous. See, Spurgeon valued spontaneity. Extemporaneous speaking and extemporaneous preaching involves this crucial element of spontaneity. See, that's where you can take a minister who can wonderfully read word for word out of his manuscript. And yet, you realize something is missing. And what is the missing element? Spontaneity. Spontaneity and the excitement and the emotions that occur when someone is spontaneously coming up with the right thing to say that moves his heart. So the Prince of Preachers did not read his sermons. He did not write out his sermons as a long essay to be read to the congregation. In his day in England, there were enough ministers or priests in the Church of England doing that. They wrote out their sermons and they read their sermons. They mumbled them out to the congregation. Other times they maybe didn't mumble them out, and there was a tradition by that time in the Church of England of ministers preparing very well written out essays. What struck me about these mainline preachers is that they had very well written out sermons. They were like a sophisticated essay that you'd read in some uppity Eastern magazine. And I've noticed that even some Reformed churches that are moving towards like a mainline Christianity. It seems like the preaching involves, very carefully crafted essays that are, they're really more a work of art and craftsmanship than really just a clear, simple, forceful, prophetic teaching of what is in the text. And this is not something that interested Spurgeon either. But see, in the Church of England, you had many priests who did that sort of thing too. So they would have these very sophisticated type of, even flowery type of presentations. And then they would read them. Of course, that's what you needed to do if you didn't memorize them. But reading a sermon would have violated principles of communication and eloquence. And that's why I don't want to read my sermons either, because it violates principles of communication and eloquence. Now, at times, Spurgeon seems to have created sermons in the carriage on the way to church. And in such cases, he had only a very short time to reflect on the text and to think about the main point and the divisions of the sermon. And he would not have had a lot of time to internalize a message. Now, but what happened in those circumstances? Was it really, truly, purely impromptu preaching? No, because of course he drew upon his understanding of the text, all of Scripture, Reformed theology, his own spiritual experience of the realities in the text, his understanding of his congregation, the needs of the lost, and the gospel of Christ, as he prepared this message and delivered it in the act of preaching. So that in the act of preaching, his mind creatively drew upon his knowledge of all of these matters. But that wasn't his normal way of doing things. But he did prepare most of the time. And the result was that along with his preparation, like I told you, his digging into the commentaries, into the biblical text, there was a marvelous spontaneity in the act of preaching, because he prepared, in some sense, the general ideas and the basic insights of the text, but in the act of preaching, he then expressed things in an original and spontaneous way. Now, it does blow my mind that Spurgeon often selected the text for Sunday morning on Saturday night. And sometimes he'd be very, very troubled when his search for a text didn't immediately lead to a selection. He didn't do what a lot of ministers do today, just preach through books of the Bible. Ezra Spurgeon did not do that. Instead, he would select an individual text. Now, his wife would sometimes even help him identify a text. And then once he had selected a text, we're told that his wife or students would read what the commentator said about the text to him. Isn't that interesting? He was orally listening to them read about what the commentator said. And then he began to work on a title for the sermon and the sermon points. He would read the text in the original language. And we're going to talk later about the importance of really wrapping your mind around the Greek text. He did careful exegesis. Now, like I said before, there were clearly weaknesses here, and that's why you and I ought to begin looking at the Greek and Hebrew text early on in the week so that we have the entire week to reflect upon it and to meditate on it. But he would attempt to do exegesis on the text, and then he would approach the act of preaching with internalized ideas. He would have internalized the main concepts in the text and the main applications of the text. And the result would be, yes, inventiveness in the act of preaching. And his mind would introduce ideas, and then he could even develop them farther than he had while he was sitting at home on Saturday night. But either way, the crucial thing is that Spurgeon was not dependent upon paper. He did not read out his sermons, and you ought not to do that either. He would not have preached from an iPad. The problem with a paper manuscript or an iPad is that they come between the pastor and the congregation. They function as a barrier between the preacher as communicator and the congregation as communicators. If a preacher is looking at his iPad, by definition, he is not looking at and reading the congregation. Has anyone ever argued that one can communicate better with a congregation by gazing at a piece of paper? Has anyone ever said you can communicate better by looking at an iPad screen? And if a minister writes out his sermon as a long essay and then feels the need to read it word for word almost, he's going to spend a lot of time gazing at his paper. And we all know that when someone keeps looking away from us in personal conversation, we feel like he's not giving us his full attention. And that's exactly what the reading preacher is not doing. He is not giving the saints his attention. Has anyone ever, in the history of communication, ever argued that it is better for a person to look away from a person with whom they are engaging in personal conversation? Has anyone ever argued that it's better for a preacher to have his eyes on his manuscript than on the congregation? Has anyone ever argued that it's better for a minister to preach with his eyes closed rather than look at his congregants? No, your eyes communicate. Your eyes are a window to your soul, and the eyes of your auditors also communicate. It's a serious error for a preacher to avoid the eyes of the members of the congregation or to hide his eyes from them. Charles Spurgeon did not preach with an iPad because he knew that the classical rhetoricians never argued that the reading of a prepared document trumped an extemporaneous delivery. And Spurgeon wanted nothing to do with what we call impromptu speech, while at the same time involving in what we call extemporaneous communication. And that's why Spurgeon, too, he takes to task those who engage in merely impromptu speech. He wants nothing to do with those who would go into the pulpit without preparation. He talks about the value of developing impromptu speaking, yes, for special occasions, but not for preaching itself. Now, I think it's unfortunate that Spurgeon himself never gave us a lecture on the topic of extemporaneous preaching as he conceived it and as he did it. That included a discussion of, for example, preaching that involves serious biblical, theological, and spiritual preparation. But he does give us a talk where he critiques impromptu type of preaching. So Spurgeon does critique impromptu approaches to preaching with no preparation, like some Pentecostals who claim, well, I have the Spirit, therefore I don't need to do any preparation. But Spurgeon does say this. He says, I might have said much more if I had extended the subject to what is usually called extempore preaching, that is to say, the preparation of the sermon so far as thoughts go and leaving the words to be found during delivery. But this is quite another matter, and although looked upon as a great attainment by some, it is, as I believe, an indispensable requisite for the pulpit, and by no means a mere luxury of talent. But of this we will speak on another occasion. And unfortunately, we don't have a record of him speaking about that on a further occasion. Spurgeon rejects what happens in Pentecostal churches where preachers deliberately do not prepare for the sermon, imagining that the Spirit will give them message apart from them rightly dividing the word of truth. He observes about radical impromptu speaking that he would not recommend, he says, any man to attempt preaching in this style as a general rule. He says the result of doing so is that the preacher, I quote, would succeed, we think, most certainly in producing a vacuum in his meeting house. His gifts of dispersion would be clearly manifested. Unstudied thoughts coming from the mind without previous research, without the subjects in hand having been investigated at all, must be of a very inferior quality, even from the most superior men. And as none of us would have the effrontery to glorify ourselves as men of genius or wonders of erudition, I fear that our unpremeditated thoughts upon most subjects would not be remarkably worthy of attention. And then Spurgeon says something very important. He says, the Holy Spirit has made no promise to supply spiritual food to the saints by an impromptu ministry. Yet he does find value in the development of impromptu speaking. He says the power of impromptu speech is invaluable because it enables a man on the spur of the moment in an emergency to deliver himself with propriety. And so there are times when a pastor suddenly needs to bring the word of God, and it's good to be prepared to do that. But he talks about how in his day he found that lawyers actually were better at extemporaneous speaking than were preachers, and he lamented the fact. He shames preachers who will not work at impromptu speech like the gentlemen of the bar do. He said, what a barrister can do in advocating the cause of his client, you and I should surely be able to do in the cause of God. The bar must not be allowed to excel the pulpit. We will be as expert in intellectual arms as any men, be they who they may, God helping us. He also talks about how in the House of Commons, in his day, he said that the politicians have exercised the faculty of extemporaneous speaking with great results. And unfortunately, in the United States here, we don't find that on the part of our politicians. They often are simply reading their speeches for the camera. But Spurgeon is talking here about the importance of ministers learning how to use their linguistic gifts in the act of preaching. He says, shall the representatives of the nation attain an expertness of speech beyond the representatives of the court of heaven? And so he talks about how he did try to develop his own abilities at impromptu speech by giving talks, for example, on Wednesday night. But he said even then, though, it wasn't totally impromptu. He would think about an issue and meditate on it, pick a topic he had read about, or even choose a Bible text that wasn't so challenging, and then he would then try to give a talk about it without having done a whole lot of preparation. But even that, is something he distinguishes from preaching, where the minister ought to prepare and where it ought not to be impromptu, but extemporaneous. Charles Spurgeon says that our sermons should be our mental lifeblood, the outflow of our intellectual and spiritual vigor, or to change the figure, they should be diamonds well cut and well set, precious intrinsically and bearing the marks of labor. God forbid that we should offer to the Lord that which costs us nothing.